So we're turning the page in our man-made chapters and verses over to chapter 17 in the book of Matthew. If you'd like to follow along in your own Bible or on your phone or on the screen, whichever you prefer. But we are going to start in chapter 17 tonight. Over the past two chapters, we've seen Jesus confronted probably at the highest level up to this point before heading to Jerusalem. He's being confronted once again at the beginning of chapter 16 by the Pharisees and Sadducees as these two opposing forces have joined forces to come against the person that seems like the biggest threat to them. And for two enemies like that to come together, that's a pretty big deal. All along the way, Jesus has been performing miracles and proclaiming that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, that it is near. He sent out his disciples to prove that same thing, to take that message out. And Jesus turns now to the closest disciples. Just about every list you see in the New Testament starts out with Peter, James, and John, and then all the rest of them. And this, what we're going to read about here is, I think, a special moment that Jesus took the three most trusted disciples up with him. Because something is about to happen. You probably read this before, but if you haven't, this is a moment where Jesus reveals yet again who he is in his divinity and all his glory and majesty. But it's in a way that the disciples, even these three, have never seen before. I wanted to start tonight out in actually verse 28 of chapter 16. Because chapter headings are all man-made. What we see coming as we close out chapter 16 and go into chapter 17 is actually just a transition of the same story. So chapter 16, verse 28, it says, "Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." As I stated last week, that this points to John in his time recorded in the book of Revelation of Jesus Christ, but it also pertains to what's happening here in chapter 17. All throughout his time leading up to this point, Jesus has been revealing this idea of this kingdom. And you can't have a kingdom without a king. And what do kings do other than reign? And that's really what we're talking about. Genesis 3 happens, man sins against God. And so Satan, his title is the God of this world. And so when Jesus is coming on the scene here, he's bringing his reign. He's starting to bring his reign back to the earth. And it's not going to come to completion until after the millennium, completely. But that's what this whole idea of the kingdom of heaven is at hand is about. And these closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, they're going to go up with him. So let's read in verses 1 through 3 here in chapter 17. It says, "After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And his clothes," somehow I skipped down a line, "and he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him." So this is interesting because all throughout the book of Matthew, he would say things like, well, and after that, this happened. Or a little bit later. This is the first time he's really very specific. And that's because it's tied into that last verse of chapter 16. Not many of you, or some of you will not die until you see the kingdom come. So 6 days later, Jesus takes these three disciples up on the mountain, and he is transfigured. There's some debate as to which mountain this is. I honestly don't know that that's even worth debating. He took them up on a high mountain, right? Whether it's Tabor or Hermon or Meron, you can debate that if you want to. The fact is, no one will ever really know until we get to heaven. To be honest with you, this desire to know this is because I found this in the commentaries I read through, and maybe there's some value to it, maybe there is. But it just felt more like it was humans trying to know all the exact details to where they'll have some greater knowledge, and maybe I don't even know why I'm talking about it now. Okay? We always want to know the deepest, darkest secrets and the mysteries of God. And we can spend hours and hours and hours digging and digging and digging, looking for things that I don't know that God really wants us to worry about. And what he really wants us to worry about is knowing him, and we do need to dig into his word to do that. But he wants us to then take what we know about him and what that means to us in our relationship with him, and then take that out to tell others about him. So, getting lost in the details here. Simply said, Jesus took these 3 disciples up on a mountain. As was his normal practice, he wanted to get away from everything to commune with the Father. This time it would be a whole other experience. The passage clearly states that it was just Jesus and these 3, because it says they were by themselves. Now, the reason why Jesus took these 3, like I said, it's most trusted. When you're going to reveal the magnitude of who you are, that should, I think what was going through Jesus' mind and what his plan was is that he wanted to reveal it to the people that would handle it well. When it says here in verse 2 that Jesus was transfigured before them, this can send all kinds of ideas through our mind. The verb there is metamorpho. It means to transfigure or transform, to change in form. It suggests a change of the innermost nature that may be outwardly visible. Essentially, this was not even a new miracle. And think about this from a disciple's perspective. You take the wrong guy up there, like the guy who's dipping his hand in the money jar, Judas, and who eventually would betray him, or even the guy that's just got a little bit different motive. You see something like this where the guy that you've been walking around with for a year and a half, however long this has been, all of a sudden completely changes appearance. You'd almost be tempted to go, hey, that's a new trick. We should gather people to come see that. Like he's some sort of sideshow. Jesus wanted them to take them up there and reveal to these few trusted ones who he really was, what he had been holding back, what he had to lay aside to be able to come down here and put on flesh and blood, to be able to be a man that looked like you and me, nothing special. And so that's really the miracle here. The miracle that for however long he's been on this earth, he's been suppressing his true glory, at least in his appearance. The real miracle was that Jesus most of the time could keep from displaying this glory. Yet John said, we beheld his glory. And Peter wrote in 2 Peter 1, we were eyewitnesses to his majesty. Spurgeon says this, for Christ to be glorious was almost a lesser matter than for him to restrain or hide his glory. It is forever his glory that he concealed his glory, and that though he was rich, for our sakes, he became poor. Matthew goes on to describe his appearance, and as I was trying to wrestle through this, I was thinking about the brightest things that we see, right? People say, don't look at the sun too long. What's another thing they tell us not to look at? Maybe not everybody knows this, but anybody ever do welding? Say, don't look at the arc. So I did a little research. Hopefully this will make sense. Essentially, and I'm going to skip a bunch of the numbers, but essentially a welding arc produces about 288,600 lumens. You buy light bulbs and it says, hey, this is 10,000 lumens. 288,600 lumens. The sun is compared, because it says his face shone like the sun. And I'm not looking for exact, but it's hard for us to comprehend this. His face shone like the sun, and he was right there. The sun is some estimated 4,580,000,000 lumens. Just a little interesting tidbit there. Jesus' description in this form is also described in the book of Revelation in chapter 1. Remember the book we talked about last week? There's a little bit of a misunderstanding I spoke about a book that if you read it out loud, you'd be blessed. And somebody else, I think Red, mentioned that too. And somebody says, what was that book again? I said, well, it's in the Bible. So it's the last book in the Bible. It's the book of Revelation of Jesus Christ. There you go. So we're going to read from that book here tonight. It says in verse 12, it says, then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire, his feet like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. So take the glimpse that Matthew gives you and add that. Because Jesus was talking with Moses and Elijah. Paints quite a picture. Skip past all my notes on the sun and welding arcs. So his clothes, we don't need to think of this like you wash your whites in Woolite. Remember Woolite? It's not like that. I would say let's just imagine his face is like the sun and his robes are like a welding arc. That's how I would suggest that might look like. This type of vision was given to, if it was given to the wrong disciple, like I said earlier, it could motivate them to take it in a wrong direction. It's amazing to consider what they saw as they gazed at Jesus, but it was also remarkable who he stood with. Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets. How many times did Jesus refer to the law and the prophets? And here he stands with 2 men, one who wrote the law as it was given to him by the Lord, and one of the many prophets of Israel, talking with the glorified Jesus. Now Moses had lived some 1,400 years before that. Elijah some 900 years before that, and yet they were alive and in some sort of resurrected, glorified state. In Luke 9:31, it actually gives us a little bit more information. It says, when it's talking about Moses and Elijah, it said, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. So that's what they were talking about. If you just read Matthew, it doesn't say what they're talking about. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there. Moses himself was a type of Christ. We see these all throughout the Old Testament. Moses had delivered the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and into the Promised Land. Elijah's return. So back up for a second. Moses had actually, it's questionable whether he actually died. It said that God buried Moses' body. It talks about in Jude about how Satan and Michael the archangel fought over Moses' body. And Elijah himself, he never died. He actually was taken up into heaven. And Micah 4:5 is a significant verse according to this passage, because the disciples are going to ask Jesus about Elijah. But let's look at Malachi 4:5 here. It says, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. So put that in the back of your mind, and we're going to move on to verse 4 in chapter 17. You got to love Peter. I often believe that I live up to his namesake. So Peter has just had this revelation, Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, turned around and said, and tempted Jesus to disobey the Father. So it could almost give you the feel that maybe he's trying to make up for things. I don't know. Don't want to read anything into it, but it says here, and Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Good old Peter. Speaking before thinking. We should learn from that. So many times we want to make what God reveals to us about us. And this great thing that he wants us to go do, when instead he wants us to just sit silently and listen and watch to what the Father is trying to reveal. And essentially that's what the Father comes on the scene and says. Here we see the English word tents used. In all practical purposes, this is more like a tabernacle. Peter's saying, let me go build 3 shrines to you. Because Moses and Elijah are pillars in the Jewish faith. So you have Jesus and Moses and Elijah. Jesus, let me go build you each a tabernacle. He was putting them on a level playing field. And so the Father coming in this cloud and overshadowing, which, by the way, is the actual Shekinah glory. Okay? So God the Father swoops in. He can't reveal himself. He has to shield himself, because anybody that comes across and sees God face to face will die, right? So he comes in and he interrupts Peter, because Peter's just speaking nonsense, and he makes the statement of the truth once again with a little addition. And that little addition is to listen to him. You're not here to talk. I don't need you to do anything for me. Jesus brought you here for this time so you could just experience in his full glory and majesty exactly who he is. This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Everything that the Father said came from the Scriptures, which makes perfect sense because he spoke the Scriptures to the people that wrote them down. But Psalm 2:7 says the Father says to the Son, you are my Son. Yeah. Isaiah 42:1, the Father says to the Son that he is one in whom my soul delights. Yeah. Or as Matthew 12:18 quotes the passage, in whom my soul is well pleased. In Deuteronomy 18:15, God the Father says through Moses, the prophet, about the coming Jesus, him you shall hear. With these words, the Father clearly sets his only begotten Son above the law and the prophets. The Spurgeon says this, if the Father says, this is my Son, observe the graciousness of our adoption. Which, with such a Son, the Lord had no need of children. He did not make us his children because he needs sons, but because we needed a father. This phrase, listen to him. If we should listen to anyone, we should listen to Jesus. One would think that a voice from heaven would say, listen to me. But the Father said, listen to him. Why? Because he is the Word. And everything points to Jesus. In verse 6, it says, when the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, rise and have no fear. And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. The disciples didn't fall on their faces when Jesus was transfigured. They didn't fall on their faces when Moses and Elijah appeared and spoke with Jesus. Or when the presence of God overshadowed them. They fell on their faces in terror and fear, admiration and awe for the Lord when the Father spoke the truth about the Son. Once again, the disciples found themselves in awe of Jesus. This helps explain the purpose of the transfiguration. To reassure the disciples that Jesus was the Messiah, even if he would indeed be crucified, as he had already surprisingly revealed. They lifted their eyes once again and saw that it was just Jesus standing there all by himself, the sole focus, the Messiah. All that they had witnessed prepared them to proceed and still believe, but in a way that would empower them to persevere. That last hidden piece of information that keeps somebody going, that God reveals to us, because I'm going to need that piece of information to hold on and not quit and not give up. When people face persecution, that's what they have to hold on to, the truth about Jesus. That's all they can hold on to. because nothing else matters. I don't think we have a clue what persecution is yet. Spurgeon says this, though the apostles saw Jesus only, they saw quite sufficient. For Jesus is enough for time and eternity, enough to live by and enough to die by. Oh, look to him, and though it be Jesus only, though Moses should condemn you and Elijah should alarm you, yet Jesus only shall be enough to comfort and even are enough to save you. Jesus comes out of this experience and gives a warning now to his disciples. He took 3 up there, and they're on their way down, and he gives them a warning. It's actually not a warning, it's a command. It says, and as they were coming down, in verse 9, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, tell no one of the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. And the disciples asked him, then why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? Remember that verse in Malachi? They know that. In fact, there's already been a conversation about John the Baptist being Elijah or having the spirit of Elijah. And the disciples asked him that. He answered, Elijah does come and he will restore all things, but I tell you that Elijah has already come and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. Wisely, Jesus told the disciples to not speak of the transfiguration until after his resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus was the final confirmation of his ministry and glory. Until then, reports of the transfiguration would be more likely to test the faith of those who did not see it rather than strengthen their faith. And this whole conversation about Elijah, we're going to tie this in here at the end as I close. Their question may go something more like this. Jesus, we know that Elijah comes first before Messiah. We know you are the Messiah, yet we just saw Elijah with you. It seems like he came after you. Jesus reassured the disciples that Elijah would indeed come first, but the first coming of Jesus did not bring the great and dreadful day of the Lord. That's the distinction from that verse in Malachi. Instead, the Malachi chapter 4, verse 5, coming of Elijah is probably best identified as the appearance of the 2 witnesses in Revelation 11, 3 through 13. You might write that down. It's not in your bulletin. So 2 witnesses are going to come, and if you read through that passage, which we're not going to cover that tonight because we'd be here till 9, the miracles that they talk about mimic the miracles of Moses and Elijah. All throughout Scripture, we are reassured that God can be trusted. Amen. We're gonna transition here. So, okay, here he's been transfigured. He tells them not to tell us. He tells us that Elijah is John the Baptist. Okay, what do we do with that? All along as we read through Scripture, and some Scripture is harder to see this than others, we're going to ask, okay, what does that have to do with me? Here, Jesus is pointing to the fact that somebody in the spirit of Elijah has already come, but Elijah is going to come before the dreadful day of the Lord, which is the second coming and the end of this world as we know it. Okay? So where do we find our hope? That to me is I was reading through this, and that's the reality of what Jesus is revealing to them or starting to reveal to them. It could cause us to go, oh goodness, there's a dreadful day of the Lord. As believers in Jesus Christ, we don't have to be worried about that day. I want to read from 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 1 through 11. And maybe this is going to hopefully bring comfort to you. It should also challenge you on how we need to be living our life every day. Let's read here. It says, now concerning the times and seasons, brothers, you have no need to have anything written to you. For you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. In other words, we have no idea when it's going to come. No idea when it's going to happen. While people are saying there's peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. But you are not in darkness, brothers, for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are all children of light, children of the day. We are not of the night or of the darkness. So then let us not sleep as others do. In other words, let us be awake. It says, let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk are drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet the hope of salvation. For God has not destined us for wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we might live with him. Therefore, encourage one another and build one another up, just as you are doing. So here's a charge here. Those verses bring great comfort to somebody who knows the Lord. But the day of the Lord that is dreadful to those who don't have the Lord. As a little boy who heard about hell when I was about 5 years old, and I was scared to death, and all I knew is I didn't want to go there, my heart in saying this is not to scare you. If you're not a believer here tonight, it is not to scare you, but I would be unloving if I did not face everyone with the reality that there is an end that is going to come, and there is one side that you're going to be on, one of two sides. You're either going to be with Jesus for eternity, or you're going to be eternally separated from him, living in agony, hellfire, and damnation, where there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. I don't like saying that, but I have to say it because he said it. And for me to not say it is unloving. Because the last thing I'd want you to do is go to hell because I didn't say anything. Therefore, encourage one another and build one another up, just as you're doing. I don't want to sit here and encourage you that you're going to go to heaven if I don't know if you're not, or if I don't know if you are. I'm not going to encourage you in something you don't have. So my encouragement to you tonight is give your life to Jesus. Tonight. For those of you who know Jesus, be encouraged. We are not destined for the wrath of God. We need to take that hope and not go, I've got something you don't have. We need to give it away. Like it's the cure for cancer, but so much better. That's our challenge. When we come here and we gather together and we love catching up with everybody and we eat some good food and we come in and sing some good songs of praise to God and we leave to go out these doors, we can easily feel like, I just did a really good thing and I feel really good about it. It's not about feelings. It's not about doing this good thing. We come here to gather together and to encourage each other and challenge each other, pray for each other, spur one another on to love and good deeds. But we got to keep doing that out there and take the gospel to the lost that are out there. That's what he's called us to do. Let's pray.